All right, fellas, the fantasy football season is dawning upon us. If you know me, you know I love fantasy football, but more importantly, I love winning fantasy football. And trust me when I say this, there's a lot of winning that goes on around here. But I also like seeing other people win, and I promise you this upcoming NFL season, I'm going to help you win your fantasy leagues. It all starts here on Yam Talks. So today we're going to dive into who I deem to be the top 40 wide receivers entering the 2025 season in PPR formats. And I'm going to categorize all these guys by tiers. I did running backs last week. I'm going to have that linked in the description and up here on the screen. So make sure you check that one out. And like I said in that video, I don't think my rankings are going to drastically change as we get closer to September, but I do think they could change this, or they will change throughout the summer with news coming out from training camp with injuries and trades and all that. But with that being said, these are my tiers. So we got tier one, league winners. These are guys who I expect could finish number one at their position. And like the name suggests, carry the scoring responsibility for your squad and win you your leagues. Tier two, we got very strong weekly starters. These are guys you're going to confidently start every single week and expect elite level production. I think these guys could realistically finish top three to top five at the position. We got tier three strong starters. These are guys for this video who are wide receiver ones. You can start them every week and expect to get top 10 to 12, top 10 to top 12 production at the position throughout the year. Tier four, we got solid starters. These are guys who are going to have weeks where they put up elite level production, but then they're going to have weeks where they maybe put up more like wide receiver two numbers because of matchups or other factors. So I think these players have a realistic potential to finish top 15 to top 24 at the position. And then tier five, low end starters. These are essentially just wide receiver twos, wide receiver threes, who you're going to have on your bench most likely, and you're going to want to start based on matchups or bye weeks and things like that. So with that being said, we're going to jump right in here into tier one. And again, these are guys who I think could finish number one at the position. And number one at the position, we're going to go with the guy who did finish number one last year by a mile, and that's Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase had the most receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and receptions, winning the Triple Crown in the NFL last year at the wide receiver position. In fantasy, he had 403 PPR points, finishing as the number one wide receiver in fantasy. The second closest wide receiver had 317 points. And the only other player to have more points than Jamar Chase in all of fantasy last year was Lamar Jackson with 430. He just got a massive extension this offseason. The Bengals defense still blows. Joe Burrow's going to be throwing the ball a lot. And in my opinion, this isn't easy. If you have the number one overall pick this year, you're taking Jamar Chase in non-superflex leagues. Next, we got the guy who did finish number two last year in Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson finished as the wide receiver one in 2022, and he no doubt would have been a top three wide receiver again in 2023 if he didn't miss 7 games with injury. There is a QB change in Minnesota with J.J. McCarthy this year, but Jettis has proven that no matter who's at the quarterback position for the team, he is an elite wide receiver and a league winner regardless of who that could be. So I definitely have him here as my wide receiver 2. Next, we've got CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy only a year ago. He helped me win some of my leagues. And last year, we saw him finish as a wide receiver 8, playing in only 15 games with Dak Prescott missing a good chunk of the year. CeeDee Lamb is by far the top target on this Dallas Cowboys team, who didn't do much this offseason to change that. You do have George Pickens coming in, who's really talented, but the production isn't there to back up that talent. And I definitely think CeeDee can finish as a wide receiver 1 this year if Dak is healthy. And while Pickens doesn't have that production, he still, like I said, has that talent, and defenses are going to divert some attention to Pickens, which should open up some more things for CeeDee Lamb. All right, guys, and then speaking of league winners, I appreciate you watching this video to gain that edge for your fantasy season, but let me help you out even more. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be releasing my fantasy football offseason guide to the public for the first time ever. I make one of these every year for myself because I play a lot of fantasy football and I win, like I said earlier. I promise you this is all you're going to need going into your drafts this season to give you a chance at winning your league, whether it be for money or just bragging rights. As a computer scientist, I've created advanced AI and machine learning models on top of my countless hours of research that provide insights and projections that could give you the edge for your fantasy drafts. You'll find my rankings, projections, notes, and so much more in this ultimate cheat sheet. And pre-ordering a guide right now will cost you only $20. I say only $20 because I put so much work into this, and honestly, it feels like I'm underselling myself. And not only do you get this league-winning tool at a lower price, but you lock in this price for life. Yeah, for life. So next summer when I introduce new advanced models and I hike up the price as this channel grows, you're still only going to pay what you paid today. So if you're interested in winning more this offseason, I'll have an email address in the description and on the screen right here. You can send a message and I'll get you all hooked up. So, or just comment down below if you don't have email for some reason and we'll get you right. And I guarantee you're going to benefit from this because I'm going to use this exact guide for my benefit. So with that being said, that's tier 1, these 3 guys in my league winning guide. Next we move on to tier 2. These are guys who you can, again, confidently start every week, and think they have realistic potential to finish as a top 3 to top 5 player at their position. So next, we got a guy who finds himself in an awesome offense, and that's Amon-Ra St. Brown. He finished as the wide receiver 3 in PPR each of the last 2 seasons, putting up monstrous numbers. And in his 4 seasons in the NFL, he's only missed 2 games. There's not much else to say here. If you're drafting Amon-Ra in the first round, you're getting a legit wide receiver 1 with top 3 fantasy potential on a Lions team that will be high-powered even without Ben Johnson. Next, you got a guy who had a phenomenal rookie year in Malik Nabers. So he finished as a wide receiver 6 as a rookie in PPR, playing in only 15 games. And this was fueled by having the second most targets in the league at wide receiver at 170 targets, only 5 less than Jamar Chase. The Giants made no significant new additions at the wide receiver position this offseason that would threaten Nabers' target share. And now you have 3 quarterbacks who are all upgrades from last year, and they're all going to start at some point in the season, in my opinion. And I also think they're going to be behind in games a lot this year, so they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. And if any of these quarterbacks want a chance to succeed, they're going to be targeting Malik Nabers. So with Malik Nabers probably commanding a large number of targets throughout the year, that usually equates to elite fantasy production with a player of this talent. So Malik Nabers does have league-winning potential, and he definitely belongs in this tier for me. And then next, we got another rookie who exploded last year in BTJ, Brian Thomas Jr. for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So BTJ was on a terrible Jags team last year, finishing as a wide receiver 4 in PPR scoring. The Jags now bring in Liam Cohen, who's an offensive guru. He was with the Rams when Cooper Kupp won the Triple Crown. He was with the Bucs when Mike Evans and Chris Godwin were wide receiver 1s in fantasy. And now he has BTJ and a hopefully healthy T-Law. And even with Mac Jones last year, BTJ was putting up crazy numbers. So yes, Travis Hunter is now in Jacksonville, but I don't think we see Travis Hunter be the number 1 option, at least for this year. And if anything, that just forces opposing defenses to respect that Travis Hunter's on the field, and that's going to open up so much for BTJ. And even if Travis Hunter is elite, I mean, this offense under Liam Cohen should be able to sustain 2 wide receiver 1s. And then next, our last guy in this tier, we got Puka Nacua from the LA Rams. Puka Nacua finished as the wide receiver 4 his rookie year in PPR scoring. And last year, he was on pace to finish as a wide receiver 3, averaging 18.8 points per game. But ultimately, he did miss 6 games with injury and finished as a wide receiver 26. But I think you should be happy with drafting Puka Nacua as your wide receiver 1 this year. Even with Devontae Adams being added to this team, and Devontae Adams being added to this team is no small matter. The last time Tay finished outside of the top 11 in PPR was in 2019. That was 6 years ago, and that's when he missed 4 games with an injury. So Puka is going to lose some touchdowns to Devontae Adams, no doubt, but he's still the number 1 younger guy on this team in a McVay offense, and he's an absolute dog, and I think he'll definitely be a top 5 to top 8 wide receiver if healthy. So that's all I got for tier 2. Next, we move on to tier 3, strong starters. So these are all wide receiver 1s, guys who I think can finish top 10 to top 12. So next, we got Nico Collins. Nico Collins, I would have him a tier up if there weren't concerns with the way CJ Stroud played last year in this horrible Texans O-line. But with these concerns and the additional additions of a couple of new rookies from the draft with Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, I had to drop him down to this tier. Nico Collins is absolutely electric. I drafted him in most of my leagues 2 years ago in like the 9th and 10th rounds when that's where his ADP was, and he ended up being a really good pickup at that time for that value. I'd still be happy with him as my wide receiver 1, especially if Stroud gets it going this year, but I'm not drafting him over the guys I have above him. And then next, move on to an elite receiver who would be in tier 1 or tier 2 if it wasn't for just the way this team's been playing lately. And that's A.J. Brown. So A.J. Brown is a top 5, top 6 receiver in the NFL, in my opinion. But it's clear that this Eagles team has found their winning formula by running the ball with Saquon Barkley and keeping the ball in the hands of Jalen Hurts. That's how they won the Super Bowl last year. And as a result, A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith see less action in the passing game. But A.J. Brown is an elite level receiver in the NFL. He's finished as a top 6 wide receiver in PPR in 2022 and 2023. And he did miss 4 games last year, finishing as the wide receiver 20. But if the Eagles, with a tougher schedule, find themselves passing the ball more and not dominating as much as they did last year, I mean, A.J. Brown is going to get the ball, and then there's definitely potential for him finishing as a top 10 wide receiver. And then next, we got another player like some of these rookies who broke out last year, but obviously not in his rookie year, and that's Drake London for the Atlanta Falcons. Drake London finished as the wide receiver 5 in PPR, and he played in all 17 games for the Falcons last year. The Falcons haven't done anything this offseason to threaten his target share as a wide receiver 1 on this team. But I do expect this team to run heavily through Bijan Robinson throughout the year. And with Michael Penix at the helm, I think they're going to rely on Bijan even more. But I still think Drake London finishes as a top 10 to top 12 wide receiver on a Falcons team that I think is going to be better than most people expect, or at least Vegas has them as, because their schedule in an easier division is really not that hard. And then next we got a super high risk, super high reward guy who you're still going to be taking in the second and at the start of third rounds. And that's Tyreek Hill. So there's been trade rumors flying around with Tyreek Hill throughout the last few months. There's been injury concerns with his wrist for months, and Tua could just unfortunately get a head injury any given week and keep him out for weeks at a time. But I'm going to be monitoring all this offseason and updating the rankings accordingly. But Tyreek was a bona fide top 5 pick in fantasy last year, and he finished as a wide receiver 2 in 2020, 2022, and 2023. So for how dynamic of a player he is and the recent fantasy success he's had, I had to include him in this tier because there is potential for him to finish as a top 10 wide receiver, no doubt. But again, there is a lot of risk involved here. And then next we got a player who was on pace to have a pretty crazy season last year as a wide receiver 2 on his team, and that's T. Higgins for the Cincinnati Bengals. T. Higgins was on pace to finish as the wide receiver 4 in PPR last year had he not missed 5 games with injury. He was averaging 18.5 points a game, and he had a 3-touchdown, 40-point game in Week 17. Like I already mentioned with Jamar, Joe Burrow is going to be throwing the ball a lot this year with this Bengals team trying to compete, and their defense probably doing them no favors. And as a result of that, T. Higgins is going to get his. And I think as a currently second-round pick, I would be really happy with him as my wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 if you go receiver. And then next, you got a guy who broke out in his sophomore season with the Seattle Seahawks, and that is JSN. JSN finished as a wide receiver 9 last year after being a really hyped-up rookie just 2 years ago. During weeks 9 through 16, he had 19 or more points 5 out of 7 weeks, and he dropped 37 points in week 9. DK Metcalf is now gone, so that opens up a lot of targets for JSN, who was already the wide receiver 1 come the end of the last season. I know Cooper Kupp's coming in here, but this isn't the same Cooper Kupp as the past. You can expect JSN to carry the wide receiver 1 scoring responsibilities for your team, but pairing him with one of those tier 1 or tier 2 guys, if you go receiver, would be even more lethal if you factor in the games where Darnold could struggle, because there might be some games here and there where maybe Darnold doesn't look that good and JSN isn't putting up that elite level production. Okay, so now we have another receiver who's been solid throughout his career, no matter who the quarterback is, and that's DJ Moore. He finished as a wide receiver 16 last year, but the Bears' offense was really bad under a rookie Caleb Williams. But he was the wide receiver 6 2 years ago in his first year in Chicago when Justin Fields was at the helm for most of the season. But now you have Ben Johnson coming in, and to be honest, DJ Moore is super similar to Amon-Ra St. Brown in the way that they can be used, and I fully expect Ben Johnson is going to bring that type of play to Chicago because they worked so well in Detroit. So DJ Moore is currently being drafted at around pick 40, which is the 4th round in most leagues. If he's your wide receiver 2 at that ADP, there's some serious potential that he puts up wide receiver 1 numbers as your second wide receiver. And then next, we got another player. I mean, the theme here is we had a lot of good rookies last year, and that doesn't change with Ladd McConkey. So Ladd McConkey was phenomenal for fantasy last year as a rookie, finishing as the wide receiver 13 in a really run-heavy offense. I definitely still think he's the number one receiving option on this team, even with the additions of washed Mike Williams and Trey Harris through the draft. At Georgia and at the NFL, he's proven to be an elite level route runner with great hands, and I don't think that's changing next year. And that equals good fantasy production when you have a player like Justin Herbert throwing in the ball and a really sound offense. But I do think his ceiling is capped at being like the wide receiver 10, wide receiver 12 overall, considering this team is super run heavy. And I don't see that changing at all with the fact that they brought in Najee Harris through free agency and Amarian Hampton through the draft. But I still think you can take Ladd McConkey as a really solid wide receiver 2 for your teams, like a really high end wide receiver 2, or a low end wide receiver 1. But I wouldn't expect league winning points from Ladd McConkey throughout the year. And then next we got another rookie, but this isn't a rookie that really lived up to the hype last year, and that's Arizona Cardinals Marvin Harrison Jr. Marvin Harrison, I'm really confident that this year the Cardinals are going to make it a mission to get their pass game going, to get Kyler going, and why would you not when you have guys like Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison? And if that passing game gets going, Marvin Harrison, and if that passing game gets going and Marvin Harrison turns into only 75% of what he was expected to be coming out of the draft last year, he's going to be a top 10 wide receiver. I want you guys to remember that Marvin Harrison was taken 4th overall last year, being labeled as potentially the best wide receiver prospect since Calvin Johnson, that's some crazy hype. If I walk out of my draft with Marvin Harrison as my wide receiver 2, if I go 2-3 wide receivers to start and he's one of them, I will be damn happy for that potential upside. And right now his ADP is in the 3rd round, which I think is a really solid spot to take a gamble on Marvin Harrison. And then next you got a guy who I do have in this tier because of the talent, but it's a player I'm fading this year. I'm not going to lie. That's Garrett Wilson. He scares me mostly because of the Jets. Offseason reports have made it clear that their new head coach, Aaron Glenn, wants to run the ball a lot. And why would you not do that when you have Justin Fields, Breece Hall, and Braylon Allen? But Garrett Wilson is no doubt the best wide receiver on this team by far. And when they do have to pass the ball, he is going to be the number 1 target for Justin Fields. I'm just personally not looking to draft Garrett Wilson as my wide receiver 2 because he's going in the 3rd round right now, and I definitely would not want to walk out of my draft with him as my wide receiver 1. I think that's a recipe for disaster. He did finish as a wide receiver 10 last year on a horrible offense, playing second fiddle to Davante Adams by the end of the year, but I'm only keeping him at this tier with all these knocks against him because he is a really solid player, and maybe I am wrong. And then next we got tier 4 solid starters. So again, these are guys who are going to have weeks where they're wide receiver 1s, but they're also going to have weeks where they're maybe like mid-end wide receiver 2s to low-end wide receiver 2s. And this is a player I went back and forth on if I should include in tier 3 or tier 4. That's Davante Adams. He was the wide receiver 11 last year where we saw him dominate in some games near the end of the year. Like I said when we were talking about Puka Nacua, Davante Adams hasn't finished outside of the top 11 in PPR since 2019. He finished as the number 1 in 2020, the number 2 receiver in 2021, and the number 3 receiver in 2022. But he's now in a Sean McVay offense that was searching hard this offseason to bring in a second option alongside Nacua with Cooper Kupp leaving. And I think Tace still has a lot left in the tank, and he should flirt with high-end wide receiver 2 numbers throughout the season. And I definitely think he will have weeks where he puts up low-end to mid-end wide receiver 1 numbers. And then the next player, I'm sure Commanders fans are going to come out of my head for this one, but I got Terry McLaurin here in the 4th tier. He did finish as the wide receiver 7 in PPR last year, but there's been some contract feuds this offseason, and Terry had his best fantasy season by a mile last year, and I just don't think he can top that this year, even with Jaden Daniels. But teams are going to study the Commanders' film and Jaden Daniels this offseason, which I think they're going to find a way to nerf him as much as they can. And I think he's a fine wide receiver 2, where he is going to have big weeks with Jaden Daniels and that offense, but I would not be banking on him winning your league as your wide receiver 1. And then next we got Rashee Rice. This was a player who unfortunately suffered an injury last year, which cut his season short, but he was on pace to finish as a top 10 receiver. He was on pace to actually finish as a wide receiver 6 in PPR and only a sophomore year. But again, week 4 injured his knee. And the bright side here is that the injury did take place in week 4 and not week 15. So he's had a lot of time to recover. And all the offseason reports up to this point look like, or seem to be pointing towards Rashee Rice not having any issues with his knee this year. Mahomes is going to need an X factor type of guy to step up to throw the ball to, with Kelsey kind of looking like he's just slowing down. It's pretty obvious. And Rashee Rice was shaping up to take that role last year. He's currently being drafted around that second and third round turn, so he's not a value player or anything. But if the injury doesn't bother him this season and he doesn't lose a significant number of targets to an emerging Xavier Worthy, then he should be definitely a top 10 to top 15 wide receiver in fantasy this year. And then next we got another guy. Talk about guys who had a promising season cut short for fantasy, and that's Chris Godwin. So Chris Godwin, before going down with injury in week 7, was averaging 19.7 PPR points. So basically 20 points a week. And he was on pace to finish as a wide receiver 2 in all of fantasy. So the Bucs just gave him a 3-year, $66 million contract this offseason. And reports came out this week that the Pats had actually offered him a $30 million contract, which he turned down. So obviously teams are not concerned about his health, and neither should you if they're right out here paying him $30 million a year. You can snag Godwin currently as your wide receiver 2 in the 5th and 6th rounds of drafts based on his ADP. I don't think he's going to be averaging 19.7 points this year with the loss of Liam Cohen and the addition of Emeka Egbuka in the draft, and a wide receiver room that already has Mike Evans and a really solid player in Jalen McMillan. But at that ADP, he's such a good pick as being your wide receiver 2 or potentially even your flex in some leagues. So I'm definitely pretty high on Chris Godwin having a bounce back here. And then next we got a guy who's the wide receiver 1 on his team, and that's Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton finished as a wide receiver 15 in PPR last year, enjoying his best fantasy season of his career with rookie quarterback Bo Nix. Sutton enters a contract here in which I still think he's the top wide receiver on this team. I do think he's a solid wide receiver 2 for teams, but I would definitely not be comfortable leaving my drafts as him as my wide receiver 1. I just don't think there's top 12 potential here with Courtland Sutton. We've never seen it, and I just don't expect it to happen at this stage of his career in Denver next year. And then next we got a guy who's a really talented receiver and, again, kind of suffers from the way the Eagles have decided to run their offense, and that's Devonta Smith. So all those arguments for A.J. Brown apply here. This Eagles team is just not going to be looking to pass the ball as much as they used to, and that just caps the ceiling for Devonta Smith. I think, again, he's a phenomenal player, but personally, I'd be more comfortable with him as my flex rather than as one of my starting 2 receivers, because I do think there are going to be weeks where he's not too involved because of, again, the run game or just A.J. Brown getting the lion's share of targets. But I think there are, again, going to be weeks where he does put up 20-plus points. So if you can snag him as your flex, I mean, I think that's phenomenal, a phenomenal spot for him to be on your team with kind of like boom or bust play every single week. And then next we got DK Metcalf. So DK was extremely disappointing for fantasy last year. He finished as the wide receiver like 30 last year. He finds himself on a Steelers team though, where he's now the number 1 option by far. And now you have Aaron Rodgers coming in, who isn't the greatest quarterback anymore, if we're being honest here. But he does find favorite targets and he does feed them. We saw it with Devontae Adams last year and somewhat with Garrett Wilson. I do think there's a world where DK finishes as a top 16 receiver if Rodgers is playing well in Pittsburgh and they build a solid connection. But I also think there is a world where he finishes as the wide receiver 30, similar to last year, if the Steelers offense just completely flops. And Arthur Smith, their offensive coordinator, is very notable for underutilizing the weapons on offense. We saw that in Atlanta, and we saw it last year in Pittsburgh too. And he just makes players on his teams really frustrating fantasy options. So I think this is a pick where it could either really work out for you as a wide receiver 2 flex kind of guy, or mostly a wide receiver 2, or just tank and just makes him a really frustrating weekly starter. And then next you got Xavier Worthy for the Kansas City Chiefs. So if I'm being honest, fully transparent, I was not a big Xavier Worthy believer coming out of the draft. He's just super undersized in my opinion. And like we've seen players like John Ross with their speed, it just doesn't equate to superstar wide receiver play every single time. And I'm not fully ready to flip my stance yet, but over the last 2 weeks of the regular season, he played because he did miss some games, and in the AFC Championship and in the Super Bowl, he combined for 29 receptions, 386 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So those are numbers you can't really just like brush aside. Those are really impressive numbers. So we did see some serious upside with him at the end of the year, which does warrant him to land in this tier for me in a Patrick Mahomes-led offense. But you guys got to remember, he was producing these numbers on a Chiefs team desperate to find someone to carry some of that responsibility on offense. But now you do have Rashee Rice coming back in and the addition of a talented rookie in Jalen Royals. So we'll see what happens with Xavier Worthy this year, but there is some potential here for sure based on what we saw at the end of the year. And then next we got another second option for team in Jameson Williams. So J-Mo finds himself as the wide receiver 2 on this really high-powered Lions offense. He did finish as the wide receiver 22 last year, and I do think he can be a solid low-end wide receiver 2 this year. But when I said that Ben Johnson leaving doesn't affect Amon-Ra St. Brown, I do think it could have an effect here on J-Mo. I don't know what this new offense is going to look like, what J-Mo's role is going to look like on this new offense. And they did add Isaac Tesla through the draft in the 3rd round. So I just wouldn't, I think what wide receiver 22 last year for J-Mo is his best case scenario for this year. But I would tamper my expectations a bit this year and expect more of like a wide receiver 24 to 26 finish in fantasy. And then next we got these guys you could flip-flop for me, and that's Jordan Addison right here. So literally the same as J-Mo here. He finished as a wide receiver 21 last year on a high-powered offense, but I'm pretty wary of Addison this year with J.J. McCarthy coming in. Again, with Jettas, that argument doesn't stand, but I think it does for Addison. And I personally, like where his ADP is right now, I would not be happy with Addison as my wide receiver 2. I just would not be comfortable and confident that would equal a league-winning team in like 10, 12 man league teams. Maybe in a 14-man league team, but not for 10, 12 or less. I would want him as my flex, though, in those like 12, 14-man leagues, but I just wouldn't bank on him as your wide receiver 2. So next we got a guy here in Zay Flowers. So Zay Flowers is a solid wide receiver for PPR, but his ceiling is capped big time in this offense with both Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson kind of running the show. We saw this last year. I mean, Zay Flowers was like, him and Bateman were just the best options on a weekly basis, more leaning towards Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers played in all 17 games last year and only managed to finish as a wide receiver 25 in PPR. So his ceiling, like I said, is capped. I would be really happy with Zay as my flex in deeper leagues, but I would not want him to be my wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 because I don't think you get league winning or really week winning numbers out of him because of how this offense runs. So that's it for tier 4. And now we move on to tier 5. So again, these are guys who you're going to start based on bye weeks or matchups. And these are likely wide receiver 2s to wide receiver 3s. I don't expect these guys to dip into the wide receiver 1 category. But we're going to start with a rookie in Tet McMillan. So I found myself moving T-Mac up my rankings a few times while I was making my rankings. And that's because I think he has everything he needs to be a productive wide receiver in his rookie year for fantasy. He has that high draft pick pedigree. He has the frame to be an NFL receiver. And he finds himself most likely by week 4 as the number 1 alpha option for an emerging Bryce Young in this Panthers offense that runs through an offensive-minded coach in Dave Canales. Like, they knew they wanted Tet McMillan. Bryce Young vouched for Tet McMillan, and I think he's going to see a lot of targets this year because of all that. And again, when you get targets and you are an elite level receiver, I mean, that's just a good recipe for fantasy, and I think he does have serious potential to crack the top 24 in PPR leagues this year. And you're getting him in like the 7th round. Not really, I'm sorry. You're getting him in like the 5th, 6th, maybe 7th rounds of your drafts right now. So I think there is some value there, especially if you've already snagged 2 wide receivers. And then next we got Khalil Shakir. So Khalil Shakir has actually never cracked the top 24 in fantasy in PPR, but he continues to build a strong connection with Josh Allen. And I like him as a potential flex this year just being that he's the Bills wide receiver 1 and coming off a 4-year contract extension this offseason, I definitely think there's really high-end flex potential for Khalil Shakir this year. And then next we got Jerry Jeudy. So maybe I'm disrespecting Jeudy a little bit, but honestly, I don't think so. Jerry Jeudy did find himself finishing as the wide receiver 12 in PPR last year after being mostly underwhelming throughout his NFL career. But a lot of that had to do with the Browns being ran with Jameis Winston at quarterback. Jameis Winston loves to sling the ball, which is great for fantasy, and they were down in a lot of games, so I mean they had to find ways to score. But I'm not confident we're going to see Judy finish as a top 20 receiver this year. Because this team is honestly most likely going to be spending the entire season figuring out who their quarterback's going to be and what their identity is on offense. So with all those factors, I just wouldn't be comfortable with Judy as my wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2, if I'm being honest. And then next we got Jalen Waddle. So unfortunately, like Jalen Waddle has just been completely phased out of this Miami Dolphins offense for these last 2 years. I'm just not confident walking out of my drafts with him as my wide receiver 2, especially if Tua goes down again. Like he's just cooked for the year. And if it wasn't for what he once was, to be honest, I don't think he would be drafted in the 5th and 6th rounds where we're seeing him be drafted right now. I think that's ridiculous considering there's some other guys in the 5th and 6th rounds who I think have way higher ceilings that are way safer picks. And then next we got Calvin Ridley. So Calvin Ridley finished as the wide receiver 28 last year in Tennessee for fantasy, and he played in all 17 games. But I do have concerns here with a rookie quarterback coming in Cam Ward. And this wide receiver room did add a bunch of new faces this offseason through the draft and free agency. If you're drafting Calvin Ridley, you need to have 2 or 3 wide receivers that are startable over him because you can't bank on him to be one of your starting 2 receivers. And then next we got Cooper Kupp. So guys, if you're drafting Cooper Kupp, do not draft Cooper Kupp expecting the Cooper Kupp of the past from 3 to 4 years ago, because unfortunately this is not the same player. If he was, the Rams would have never let him walk, if we're being honest here. He finds himself on a team where the position he already excels in, the slot, is already filled up by an up-and-coming stud in JSN, who we talked about earlier. I do think we'll see weeks where Cooper Kupp isn't contributing much to fantasy, but I don't think he's a bad bench stash in case things do click here on a team that is desperately going to need that second receiving option out of JSN with DK Metcalf gone. And then next we got a player who was pretty underwhelming in his rookie year, and a lot of that had to do with how terrible the offense was, and that's Rome Odunze. Rome Odunze was selected 9th overall in last year's draft. And he earned that hype that got him the 9th overall pick over in Washington, but he managed to only finish as the wide receiver 49 in PPR scoring. But as we all know, the Bears' offense was a mess, and that environment does not bode well for a rookie to find success. And again, with Ben Johnson coming in this year and Keenan Allen gone and Caleb Williams, who should be taking a step up this year, I wouldn't be surprised if Rome Odunze turns into like what J-Mo or Jordan Addison were last year as a top 24 receiver, and maybe even more potentially. If this Bears offense and Caleb Williams are going to take that step next year to be better on offense, Rome Odunze is definitely going to play a major role in that, and in turn be fantasy relevant. So next we got a guy who I am going to definitely be targeting, and I think you should be too, after you've grabbed your wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2, and that's Ricky Pearsall. So the 49ers took him in the 1st round last year, and I was a huge fan of Pearsall going into the draft, but he was shot in the chest as a rookie before the season started, and he missed all of training camp and almost half of his rookie year. So that's a lot of valuable time missed for a rookie. But in the last 2 games of the season, he dropped 28.7 and 18.9 PPR points as it looked like he was finally heating up. So this Niners team has an identity crisis at receiver right now with Debo gone, Ayuk suffering a devastating injury, Juwan Jennings being the most viable option outside of George Kittle. And this Niners team has a cakewalk of a schedule next year. It's the easiest schedule by a mile. They're projected to win 11 to 12 games, according to Vegas. And I'm fully expecting Kyle Shanahan to utilize their 1st round pick in Pearsall to give them the chance to win those 11 to 12 games. His current ADP puts him in the 6th or 7th round, and there's a solid chance he could break out this year because he is the prototypical PPR type of player, and he could outperform that 6th round ADP very easily. And then next we got Jacoby Myers. So in real life, Jacoby Myers is a really solid receiver. He is the number 1 option at receiver for this Raiders team. He finished as the wide receiver 19 in PPR last year, and I don't hate drafting him as a bench option later in your drafts. That could be a really viable flex for a good amount of the year. But by week 6, I fully expect this Raiders offense to be running through Ashton Genty. And the true number 1 target on this team is Brock Bowers, the younger Brock Bowers who put up historical numbers at tight end last year. And Jack Betch does come in a rookie wide receiver, but I just don't think with all that, I don't think Jacoby Myers can hit that top 20 mark again this year. But again, I think he is a very viable flex option, especially in 10 to 14 man leagues. Or 12 to 14, not really 10. But then next we got Chris Olave. So Chris Olave, once upon a time, only a year ago, was like a second, third round pick in drafts. But I'm fully fading Olave this year. There's some injury concerns with his head with all these concussions lately. He's been piling up. And this Saints team, I think, is going to be absolutely trash next year. While they try to find their answer at quarterback, are they going to try to answer if Spencer Rattler or Tyler Shaw are their quarterbacks of the future? And spoiler, I don't think either one of these guys are. I just don't want anything to do with this team outside of Kamara, guys. And then lastly, for this video, we got another rookie receiver in Travis Hunter on the Jacksonville Jags. If this video is based on ranking wide receivers based on talent or athleticism, no doubt Travis would be in tiers 1 or 2. But we just don't know what to expect with Travis Hunter yet. He's no doubt going to be the second fiddle to BTJ this year because BTJ had a crazy year last year and is, I think, the top receiver on this team. And it's still unclear how many snaps Hunter's going to get on the offense versus the defense, even though the Jags have came out and said Travis will be playing primarily offense this year. But Hunter is currently going in the 5th round of drafts, and I think that's a huge gamble on a player like this. Because if you're taking him in the 5th round, he's likely going to be he's slotted to be a starting player in your team. And he might find himself playing less snaps in offense throughout the year, and that's not going to bode well for you. My recommendation for Travis Hunter is that you hold off on him until next year's drafts when we know what his role is on this team. And if you're paying 1st or 2nd round capital for him next year, if he blows up at receiver, that's fine. But I just don't expect him to produce at that wide receiver 1 level this year. So I just don't think he's worth taking in the 5th round. But that's who I have as my top 40 receivers as promised. There's still a lot of quality guys on my rankings. So if you want to see the rest of my rankings, make sure you email me for my fantasy draft offseason guide. But that's it, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Keep an eye out for the rest of the positions at quarterback and tight end over the next week or two. And yeah, let's win some games this year, guys. Peace.